Just a nurse. That's what they saw when Margaret Walsh clocked in at 11:15 on a Tuesday night. Silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Sensible shoes. A cardigan that had been navy once, now faded to the color of old sky. 19 years, that's how long Oak Creek Memorial had employed her, though most of the day's shift couldn't place her name. She moved through the corridors like water, noticed only when something broke. They didn't know her hands had held more lives together than they'd ever save in their careers. They didn't know that the slight limp in her left leg came from shrapnel in Kandahar, pulled out in a field hospital under blackout conditions. They didn't know that when Margaret Walsh breathed, 2 counts in, 4 counts out, she was using the same tactical breathing taught at Fort Bragg to operators before insertion. What happened next would change everything. The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial settled into its familiar rhythm. The ER hummed with low-grade chaos, a teenager with a suspected overdose in Bay 2, a construction worker with a lacerated hand in Bay 4, the usual wear and tear of a Norfolk hospital in the hours when most of the city slept. Margaret moved through it all with the kind of invisibility that only comes from making yourself useful without demanding recognition. She restocked the trauma bays with methodical precision. Gauze in columns. Chest tubes arranged by size. Scalpels in their trays, sterile and waiting. The fluorescent lights above hummed their mechanical song, bright enough to turn everyone's skin pale, casting shadows under eyes that had been awake too long. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air like a constant reminder that this place was built on the boundary between order and catastrophe. At 11:43, Margaret was in Trauma Bay 3, pulling open a supply cabinet to restock the crash cart. The intercom had been quiet for 17 minutes, a relative eternity in emergency medicine. She worked with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times before, moving each item with deliberate care. Airway equipment. Medications in their pre-filled syringes. The small red packets that contained everything needed to push someone back from the edge of death. Her movements were economical, practiced. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The kind of competence that nobody noticed because nothing went wrong. Dr. Marcus Ashford, Chief of Emergency Medicine, passed through the corridor at 11:48. He carried a laptop and the posture of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. 47 years old, educated at Johns Hopkins, with publications and a salary that put him in the top percentile of physician earners in Virginia. His watch, a Rolex Submariner that cost more than Margaret's annual salary, caught the fluorescent light as he moved. He barely registered her presence. To him, she was part of the furniture. A fixture. Efficient, quiet, forgettable. He'd never asked her name. He'd never asked her opinion on a patient. He'd never asked her anything at all. What he didn't know was that Margaret's peripheral vision had been trained to catch movement. Her eyes had been positioned to monitor the medication room where he was heading. The room with the controlled substances. The room where the documentation happened. Ashford settled himself at the medication dispensing station at 11:51. The laptop opened with a soft click. His fingers moved across the keyboard, quick and practiced, pulling up a spreadsheet that shouldn't have been accessible to him. Drug trial data. Dosage documentation. Records from a pharmaceutical company contracted by the Department of Defense. The trial was for a new anti-inflammatory agent intended for combat trauma. The data looked clean on the surface. The numbers aligned. The progression was logical. Margaret had paused at the small window that looked into the medication room. She wasn't supposed to be looking. The angle was accidental. Her hands held sterile packages of 14-gauge angiocath needles, routine stock rotation. Her eyes, however, had caught something in the reflection of the screen. Numbers that didn't belong there. Dosages climbing higher with each trial iteration. The kind of escalation that didn't happen by accident. The kind that happened when someone was trying to bury data. When someone was systematically adjusting records to hide the fact that the medication was causing adverse effects. Dangerous ones. The kind that left patients bleeding internally. The kind that required transfusions and ICU admits and sometimes ended with a body in the morgue. She watched for 8 seconds as Ashford's fingers moved across the keyboard. The entries he made were precise. Professional. A man who had done this before. He was changing the baseline numbers, which meant the statistical analysis would shift. The dosage that had caused 3 hemorrhagic events in the trial would appear safe. The side effects would be invisible. The drug would get approved. And somewhere, on a military base or a hospital ship or a forward operating base in a country Margaret had once bled in, soldiers would receive a medication they thought was saving their lives while it was actually destroying them. Ashford's eyes lifted from the screen. For half a second, just long enough, he made eye contact with Margaret through the small rectangular window. Her face was neutral. Professional. The expression of a nurse who had seen it all and been shocked by none of it. But her eyes. Her eyes had seen him. Had witnessed the act. Had recorded it with the kind of precision that made his jaw tighten and his fingers pause for a heartbeat over the keyboard. She turned away first. Not in fear. Not in hesitation. With the measured movement of someone simply returning to their work. Margaret closed the medication cabinet with a soft click and walked back down the corridor toward Trauma Bay 3, her footsteps soundless on the linoleum tile. Her left leg made the faintest whisper as it moved, the old injury, barely perceptible unless you knew to listen for it. Behind her, Ashford's fingers resumed their work, faster now. More urgent. His jaw had gone tight as wire. The next words out of his mouth would change everything. Margaret completed her restocking of Trauma Bay 3 in 4 minutes. The crash cart was ready. The defibrillator pads were fresh. The medications were arranged in the exact sequence they'd need to be accessed during a code. She made a note in the supply log, a habit she'd maintained for 19 years, documenting what had been used, what had been replaced, what was ready. The pen felt good in her hand. Familiar. The same brand she'd been using since 1994. The hospital continued around her. A monitor beeped in the distance. Someone paged a resident over the intercom. The automatic doors to the ER entrance wheezed open and shut, cycling through with mechanical regularity. 11:59. The shift was still young. Margaret knew how this night would go. It would be quiet until 1 a.m., then something would arrive, a trauma or a medical emergency or a combination of both. There would be a period of controlled crisis, followed by another quiet stretch. The rhythms of emergency medicine were as predictable as tide charts if you'd worked enough nights to see the patterns. What she didn't know was that at exactly 11:51 a.m. the next morning, a helicopter would land on the roof of Oak Creek Memorial. What she didn't know was that the patient they'd bring down would be someone she hadn't allowed herself to think about in 4 years. Someone who had held her son as he died. Someone who had been there when Daniel's blood ran out on a dusty street in Helmand Province. Someone she'd tried to forget because remembering made the silence unbearable. But for now, it was just another night shift. Just a nurse in sensible shoes, restocking supplies, invisible and efficient. Just a woman who had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, her face revealing nothing. Just a moment of contact between two people who had no idea that the next 48 hours would tear everything open. At 12:04 a.m., Ashford stepped out of the medication room. He'd closed the laptop. He'd cleared the cache. He'd done what he needed to do. But his eyes found Margaret as she passed the nurse's station, and in that look was something sharp and dangerous. Recognition. Threat assessment. The calculation of someone figuring out whether they had a problem that needed solving. Margaret felt the weight of that gaze, acknowledged it with the faintest nod, and continued toward room 304 to check on the post-op patient recovering from abdominal surgery. She didn't know that room 304 was about to become the center of everything. She didn't know that a Navy SEAL named Lieutenant Commander Hayes was already in transport from Bagram, his helicopter 8 hours out, his shrapnel wounds packed in surgical dressing, his blood type already in the system, his chart being prepared for arrival. She didn't know that the man she'd tried to forget was coming home. All she knew was that Ashford was watching. And that what she'd seen in that medication room was going to cost someone their life unless it was stopped. and that she was just a nurse in a hospital where nobody asked questions, where silence was survival, where 19 years of service meant nothing against a single moment when the wrong person noticed you noticing. The night stretched ahead of her like an open road. The overhead speaker crackled at 0600 hours. Static hissed. Then the page echoed across 3 floors of Oak Creek Memorial, carrying Dr. Ashford's voice with the precision of a man who knew exactly how loud to speak. Granny Walsh to pediatrics. Granny Walsh to pediatrics. Someone's grandkid needs their diaper changed. Laughter rippled through the nurse's station like electricity through water. Margaret set down her patient chart on the 3rd floor medication cart without hurrying. Her silver hair caught the fluorescent light as she pulled it tighter in her bun, a gesture 19 years of night shifts had turned automatic. One measured breath. She didn't look at the nurses watching her. She didn't acknowledge the smirk on the face of Rita, Dr. Ashford's charge nurse, the one he'd been grooming for the position Margaret should have earned in 2015. She pressed the elevator button. The door slid open with a hydraulic whisper. When she arrived at pediatrics, the floor was empty. No patients waiting. No charts demanding her attention. The charge nurse looked at Margaret with confusion written across her face like a diagnosis. "I didn't page for you. We're fully staffed." Margaret took another measured breath. She turned and walked back to the elevator, her shoes making no sound against the linoleum, the kind of silence that comes from someone who has learned how to move through spaces without leaving a trace. 2 hours of being invisible. That was the point. That was always the point. By mid-morning, Dr. Ashford had moved to the next stage. The supply closet on the 3rd floor was narrow, designed for storage, not conversation. Margaret was counting trauma shears when the door swung open and Dr. Ashford stepped inside, closing it behind him. He stood too close. The kind of too close that isn't an accident. His cologne smelled like money and entitlement, bergamot and something synthetic that made her sinuses tighten. "Margaret." He leaned against the shelves. "I've been meaning to talk to you." She continued counting. 6, 7, 8. Her voice was steady. The voice of a woman who had witnessed far worse than this. "I've noticed some concerning signs lately." He pulled a pen from his pocket and clicked it. Once. Twice. A nervous habit, the sign that competent predators showed when they sensed their prey might be different than they assumed. Memory lapses. Confusion with protocols. Small things, but notable. Margaret met his eyes. Not defiant. Not submissive. Just present. A woman looking at a man without fear in her pupils. "At your age," he continued, and the words were chosen with deliberate care, "perhaps it's time to consider early retirement. Wouldn't want anything unfortunate on your record. Something that might affect your pension. 30 years of service, that's significant. We'd hate to see that tarnished." She took one measured breath through her nose. The air in the closet was thick with industrial cleaner, bleach and ammonia combining into something sharp enough to cut. A single tear escaped her left eye. Not from sadness. Not from fear. From the precision of it, how perfectly he had chosen the one thing that mattered. Her pension. Her retirement. The thing that had kept her walking through these halls when she had no other reason to walk. She wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. "I've survived worse men than you." Dr. Ashford stepped back. His smile became tight. A smile that wasn't a smile but the absence of a smile being forced back into place. He left the closet without another word, and Margaret remained standing among the surgical supplies, her hand steady on the boxes of trauma shears, breathing air that tasted like disinfectant and humiliation. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, the parking lot was full. The day shift was arriving, nurses in their scrubs, techs carrying equipment, the whole machinery of Oak Creek Memorial shifting from night operations to day operations. Margaret had finished her shift and was walking toward her 2007 Camry, her badge swinging from her neck on a lanyard that had been there so long the plastic was worn smooth. Dr. Ashford intercepted her near the second row of cars. He had personnel director Chen with him, a woman Margaret had known for 8 years, a woman who had always nodded at her in the hallway, always said good morning. Margaret. He held a clipboard. I wanted to do this personally. 15 nurses stood by their cars, keys in hands, watching. The kind of watching that happens in parking lots, when there's nothing to do but see something unfold. Chen shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes couldn't quite meet Margaret's. Effective immediately, Dr. Ashford continued, you're being reassigned to environmental services. Janitorial rotation. We need experienced staff in all departments, and your background suggests you'd be perfect for the position. Consider it a fresh start. His words were clean. Professional. The kind of words that would look perfect in an HR file. The kind of words that, when read out of context months from now, would sound reasonable. Generous, even. Margaret took the assignment sheet from the clipboard. Her hand was steady. Not trembling. Not shaking. The hand of someone who had held hands during dying and never flinched. What floor? She asked. Dr. Ashford smiled. His eyes had the light of a man who believed he had finally broken something. Start with the ICU. I'm sure the nurses there will appreciate the extra help. Someone whispered. Margaret didn't try to hear what they said. She folded the paper once and walked to her car. She got in. She started the engine. She waited for the AC to come alive, then she pulled out of the parking lot and drove home through Norfolk traffic, watching the street signs pass like chapters in a book she'd already read. That evening, she stood at her husband's grave in Cedar Grove Cemetery. The rain had started at dusk, and by the time she arrived, it was coming down in sheets that hammered against her jacket like applause. Water streamed down her face as she knelt in front of the stone. Robert Walsh, 1959 to 2019, beloved husband, beloved father. She whispered to the wet grass, I couldn't save Daniel, and now I can't even finish what you started. I failed you both. The rain kept falling. The cemetery was empty except for her. She left at 2,100 hours, long after visiting hours had ended. She drove to Oak Creek Memorial not in her nurse's uniform but in dark jeans and a hoodie, her old security badge still hanging in her car, the one from before they upgraded the system in 2021. She parked in the back lot near the stairwell and let herself into the building through the service entrance. The badge still worked. The system hadn't updated her status yet. The ICU was quiet except for the steady percussion of monitors. 7 patients tonight, all critical. All fighting. She stood outside room 304 and looked through the glass at the man sleeping in the bed. Navy SEAL Lieutenant Commander Hayes, evacuated from Bagram with shrapnel wounds to his chest and abdomen. Multiple surgical repairs. Critical but stable. The monitors showed a sinus rhythm steady as a drummer who had played through 1,000 songs without missing a beat. She knew his face from the photograph her son Daniel had sent her 4 years ago, the one with Hayes' arm around Daniel's shoulders in front of a white building with no name. The team commander. The man who had held her boy in Helmand Province while Daniel's blood turned the Afghan dust red. She reached for the door handle. Then she didn't. Instead, she photographed his chart from outside the glass with her phone. The medication orders signed by Dr. Ashford. The dosage combinations that made her pause, a pause that came from 19 years of watching medications move through bodies and 19 other years of watching them move through different kinds of bodies, in places where dosages meant the difference between healing and poisoning. She took 3 photographs. She left the ICU without speaking to anyone. She drove home at 2,300 hours and sat in her kitchen staring at the screen of her phone, at the orders written in Ashford's careful handwriting, at the prescriptions that didn't quite add up. The next morning, she arrived for her janitorial shift at 0600 hours. She pushed her mop cart toward the ICU. Her badge slid into the reader. The light flashed red. Access denied. She tried again. Red. Denied. Again. Red. A nurse she didn't recognize appeared on the other side of the locked doors. "Can I help you?" "Janitorial assignment," Margaret said. "ICU." The nurse checked her tablet. "There's no assignment for environmental services in this unit. Dr. Ashford restricted access." "Are you supposed to be here?" Margaret backed up one step. She pulled out the assignment sheet from her pocket. "Started yesterday." "Well, something's wrong with the system then." The nurse sounded apologetic. "I'm not seeing you in the ICU rotation. You'll need to check with." Margaret was already walking away, her mop bucket rolling behind her like a ghost. She mopped the 4th floor instead. And the 2nd. And the lobby. And she watched, from the corners where she'd learned to disappear, as Dr. Ashford changed the visitor log for room 304 to family only. As he reassigned the ICU nursing staff, rotating his most loyal nurses, Rita and 2 others, into Hayes's direct care. As he updated the restricted access list with employee numbers, one of which was hers. She was being systematically removed from the man who held her son's dying body. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. The medication room smelled like antiseptic and lies. Margaret stood outside the threshold, restocking the crash cart from her supply cart, when she saw Dr. Ashford lean over the medication dispensary unit. His fingers moved across the touch screen with the precision of a man who'd done this 100 times before. Ordered amphetamine scripts. Altered dosage logs. Changed the bastard's handwriting just enough that the pharmacy wouldn't flag it. But Margaret had worked with medications for 19 years. She recognized the pattern. She recognized the crime. Hayes's sedation order was climbing. For milligrams of midazolam at 1800 hours. Then 6 milligrams at 2000. Then 8 milligrams at 2200. The standard protocol for a post-operative SEAL with shrapnel wounds was 2 to 3 milligrams every 4 hours. Ashford was doubling it. Tripling it. Keeping him unconscious. Keeping him silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Margaret's jaw clenched once. Once. Then she turned and pushed her cart toward the supply closet, moving with the careful invisibility she'd perfected across 2 decades of being the woman no one watched. But she was watching. She was always watching. That afternoon, she found charge nurse Rita at the medication station, pulling up Hayes's current vitals on the computer screen. Margaret's voice came out measured, professional, the deferential tone of a floor nurse consulting her superior. "Rita, I noticed the sedation protocol on room 304 is escalating. Standard post-op is 2 to 3 milligrams. Dr. Ashford has him scheduled for 8. That's outside the trial parameters." Rita didn't look up from the monitor. Her fingers continued typing. "Environmental Services doesn't consult on patient care, Margaret. Dr. Ashford is very clear about the chain of command." The words came out automatic, rehearsed, as if Rita had already been briefed. Rita glanced sideways, just barely. "And honestly? Your concerns are noted. We'll handle it from here." Noted. Dismissed. Filed away in the trash. Margaret nodded once. She didn't argue. Arguing would draw attention. Arguing would make her visible. She turned and left the medication station, her scrub pants whispering against her legs as she moved toward the supply closet, where the inventory forms and bandage rolls waited in the dark. But not before she saw Rita pick up her phone and text something to someone. Not before she saw the message read back, "Done." The shift change came at 1600 hours. Margaret had been assigned to days for the past 3 years. Stable. Predictable. A nurse who showed up, did her work, and asked nothing of the institution that employed her. That shift changed at 1600 hours, posted to the schedule board in the break room in handwriting that definitely belonged to Dr. Ashford. New assignment, overnight. Environmental Services. 2200 to 0600. The graveyard rotation. The isolation chamber. The hours when the hospital skeleton crew barely acknowledged anyone in the hallways. Her access card was waiting at the security desk. A new card. Same photo, same name, but the color had changed from white to yellow. Yellow meant limited access. Yellow meant janitorial closets and public hallways and nowhere near the ICU. Nowhere near Hayes. Margaret slipped the card into her pocket without comment. The security guard didn't even look at her. Nobody ever did. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 14 minutes, engine off, hands on the steering wheel. Rain had started to fall, light at first, then harder, drumming against the windshield like Morse code. Her phone was in her lap. She pulled up the Virginia Board of Nursing's emergency line and dialed. The message she left was clinical, precise, filed like a formal complaint. Medication protocol deviations in a DEA-monitored clinical trial. Room 304. Oak Creek Memorial ICU. Dosages far exceeding standard postoperative parameters. Potential obstruction of federal oversight. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. She sounded like a nurse who'd simply noticed something wrong. A nurse who cared about patient safety. A nurse who had nothing to hide. 2 hours later, Dr. Ashford sat in his office on the 5th floor and received a return call from the Virginia Board of Nursing. He sat on the board's advisory committee. The call was a courtesy. A heads up. Someone had filed a complaint about medication protocols on a defense contractor trial, and the board wanted to verify the allegations before investigating. Dr. Ashford thanked them for their diligence and assured them everything was protocol compliant. The complaint was likely from a disgruntled nurse without proper credentials. He knew exactly who. At 2,200 hours, Margaret parked her Honda in the loading dock lot and entered through the service entrance. The yellow access card didn't work on the main elevators. But she knew the hospital layout. 19 years of walking these corridors. 19 years of learning the passages that weren't supposed to exist. The service elevator was behind the kitchen, accessible from a hallway that smelled like burnt coffee and industrial grease. The elevator creaked upward. 3rd floor. ICU corridor. She didn't use the main entrance. She used the biohazard disposal corridor, the route that bypassed the security checkpoint, where she'd walked 1,000 times with contaminated dressing kits and soiled linens. The ceiling was lower here. The lights were dimmer. The smell of bleach and something darker hung in the recycled air. Her shoes made no sound on the concrete floor. Muscle memory took over. The kind of muscle memory that came from moving through hostile territory, from being trained to disappear into shadows while staying in plain sight. The ICU window was ahead. Through the glass partition, she could see into room 304. Hayes lay sedated, his massive frame diminished in the hospital bed, his chest rising and falling under the ventilator's mechanical rhythm. His vitals climbed across the monitor. Heart rate elevated. Blood pressure climbing. The sedation was working, keeping him unconscious, but his body was screaming. Ashford was overdosing him into silence. Rita stood at the forestand, adjusting the drip. Increasing it. Following Ashford's orders like a dog on a leash. Margaret's phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't reach for it. She watched Rita work. Watched her finish the adjustment and step back, satisfied. Then Margaret turned away from the window. In the biohazard corridor, alone, she pulled out her phone. The text was from an unknown number. Military protocol. Encrypted routing. The message was 3 lines, Major Walsh. Stand down. Your cover holds only if you stay invisible. DOD liaison. She read it once. Deleted it. The message could be traced back to the Pentagon, to someone deep inside the Defense Intelligence Agency who knew exactly who she was and what she'd done. Someone who understood that exposure meant endangering 12 people still alive in countries that wouldn't protect them. 12 people whose extraction she'd orchestrated. 12 people whose names she'd never speak aloud. She walked back toward the service elevator. The rain was heavier now. She could hear it against the hospital's exterior walls, a distant percussion that meant the outside world was still turning while she moved through these hallways like a ghost. But not yet. Not while Hayes was drowning in medication. At midnight, Margaret changed out of her scrubs in the locker room. The hallways were quieter now, skeleton crew, a nurse and an aide per floor, mostly in the break room pretending to work. She'd timed this. She always timed everything. She'd learned timing from people who died when they miscalculated by 30 seconds. Her street clothes went back into the locker. She pulled on fresh scrubs from the supply cabinet, dark blue, unmarked, the kind every nurse in the hospital wore. Generic. Invisible. She kept her yellow access card but moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in these hallways, who had a right to be here, whose presence was so ordinary that security cameras didn't really see her. The ICU entrance door required a proper badge swipe. She still had her old white card in her locker. She'd anticipated this. A white card got you through. The door clicked open. The ICU was dim, the monitors casting everything in blue and green light, the ventilators hissing their mechanical breaths in stereo. She moved directly to room 304. 90 seconds. That was the margin. Rita's station faced the opposite direction. The other ICU nurse was down the corridor, charting in a computer room. 90 seconds was an eternity for someone trained to work in silence. Margaret stepped into Hayes's room and closed the door without a sound. His pupils were dilated, unfocused. His breathing was shallow, dependent entirely on the ventilator's settings. She checked his respiratory rate. 8 breaths per minute. Too slow. Dangerous. She checked his pupil's response to her penlight, sluggish, delayed. She ran her fingers along his surgical sites, feeling for swelling, infection, signs of sepsis. Everything underneath was healing correctly. But the medication was drowning him. His hand moved. Just slightly. His fingers twitched, trying to find something solid in the darkness. She stood there for one more second and protocol allowed, and then she was gone. Out the door. Down the corridor. Back through the service hallway before Rita's monitor alarm brought her running. She was in the biohazard corridor when she heard Rita's footsteps thunder past in the ICU. Moving toward Hayes's room. Moving to check on the patient whose sedation was failing because Margaret hadn't touched anything. She'd only observed. Only witnessed. Only stood at the bedside of a man whose dying was being orchestrated in slow motion, and decided that 90 seconds was enough to remember she'd failed one seal but wouldn't fail another. At 0340 hours, the crash alarm screamed through Oak Creek Memorial like a siren from another world. Code Blue, ICU, room 304. Hayes was flat-lined. Margaret was 2 floors down in the hazmat waste room when the overhead beeping started, that staccato pulse that meant someone's heart had stopped being a heart and become a problem. She knew the sound. She'd heard it in Kandahar too, that electronic scream that meant 30 seconds was all you had before 30 seconds became forever. She left the biohazard bin where it was and moved. The ICU doors were locked. She slammed her palm against the glass hard enough that the resident inside flinched, a young doctor she recognized from rotation, someone who'd watched her mop floors without seeing her face. He hesitated. She slammed again. The door clicked open and he said something about authorization and credentials and protocols, but his voice had the thin quality of someone reciting rules he didn't believe in. Hayes was already flat-lined. Monitor showing nothing but the horizontal line of death. The code team had assembled around him like pallbearers, the attending, 2 residents, 3 nurses, and someone had made the first mistake. They'd grabbed the pediatric defibrillator pads from the crash cart. The one sized for children. They wouldn't achieve contact on a chest the size of Hayes's, built from 18 years of swimming and climbing and the kind of physical brutality that separated SEALs from everyone else. The rhythm wouldn't transfer. They were fumbling. That was the word. Fumbling. Margaret shoved past the resident and into the space where the air had turned sharp and electric, smelling of blood and adrenaline and the acrid scent of a body in total system failure. No one stopped her. The attending looked up, opened his mouth, and something in her eyes made him close it again without words. She reached for the scalpel on the crash cart. "Stand aside," she said. Her voice had dropped into the register she'd buried for 3 years, the voice that had commanded 14 personnel through a collapsed apartment building in Kabul while insurgents fired from the rooftops. The voice that no nurse in Norfolk had ever heard. The attending moved. Her hands knew this. They'd done this before in a makeshift triage unit with nothing but field supplies and the knowledge that the next 60 seconds would either bring a 70-year-old grandfather home or leave him in a grave outside the Helmand province. Hands that had held lives together. Hands that remembered everything her mouth had agreed to forget. The scalpel cut clean between the 3rd and 4th ribs. Left anterior lateral thoracotomy, the surgical approach taught to battlefield medics when the hospital was too far away and time was a currency you couldn't afford to spend. She cut through the intercostal muscles, muscle memory took over, each stroke precise, and opened the pericardium with a gloved finger. Hayes's heart sat there, still and useless, the size of a clenched fist, the color of a ripe plum. "Lap pads," she said. The trauma nurse moved before the attending could process the order, sliding absorbent pads into the cavity. Suction. Her right hand found the heart and lifted it gently into her palm. It was warm and heavy and it wasn't beating. She began compressions with the flat of her other hand against the posterior wall, the rhythm automatic, 90 compressions per minute, the beat of a life that had stopped and needed to remember how to start again. "Charge to 20 joules," she said. "Internal paddles." No one questioned her. That was the strangest part. In crisis, authority doesn't announce itself with credentials or paperwork. It announces itself by moving like you know where you're going. By speaking like you've done this before. By having hands steady enough to hold someone's beating heart and not let it fall. The resident handed her the internal defibrillator paddles without being told which ones to use. She positioned them and said the word, "clear." The shock traveled through her hands. Hayes's heart convulsed in her palm. Once. Twice. And then, the electrical storm of the moment passed and something shifted. A spasm. An actual muscular contraction that meant his own nervous system was waking up and remembering how to beat. She held his heart and felt it slip back into sinus rhythm, felt the flutter become the steady percussion of a living thing. The monitors above began to sing, that blessed beeping that meant the horizontal line had learned how to climb again. Margaret stepped back. Her hands were soaked in blood to the elbows. The ICU was frozen around her, the attending physician with his mouth half open, the nurses staring like they'd watched someone resurrect the dead, the resident who'd stopped breathing somewhere between her first cut and her last shock. 12 staff members. All of them staring at her. She removed her gloves with precise movements and dropped them into the biohazard bin. The young resident tried to find his voice. That was, "You performed cardiac surgery without." But Margaret had already turned toward the door. Dr. Ashford arrived 6 minutes later, still in his clothes from last night's sleep, his hair wet from the shower he'd taken before the hospital called. He stopped in the doorway and looked at Hayes, alive, stabilized, the monitors keeping rhythm like a metronome, and then his eyes found Margaret, still standing at the sink washing the blood away, her back to him, her shoulders steady. She heard him recognize something in that moment. Not her face. Her hands. The way she'd moved through that crisis like someone who'd stopped counting the lives she'd held together. The way she'd issued commands that made people obey without thinking to resist. The way her surgical technique had been less civilian emergency nursing and more something they taught at Fort Bragg to people with different identification cards. His face drained of color. Not because Hayes had lived. Because Margaret had revealed something that dead men can keep buried but living ones sometimes talk about. Because a Navy SEAL would eventually ask who taught her to perform emergency thoracotomies with that particular kind of precision. Because somewhere in this hospital, there was now a witness. By 0600 hours, Ashford had made his first phone call to the state nursing board. By 0630, he'd contacted hospital administration. By 0700, security had been instructed to restrict her access pending investigation. The paperwork came at 0800 in a parking lot, a security officer with the expression of someone handing over bad news, a termination letter, the word unauthorized underlined 3 times. Margaret sat in her car in the employee parking area for 40 minutes and did not cry. She did not tremble. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel and thought about the last promise she'd made to her husband at Arlington. Thought about Daniel's ashes mixed with Arlington soil. Thought about Hayes, alive now because she'd broken 3 regulations and revealed 20 seconds of competence she'd spent 3 years learning how to hide. Rain began to fall at 1,130 hours. By 1300, it had become the kind of downpour that made the world outside the windshield disappear. Margaret drove to Arlington Cemetery anyway. The rain didn't care about her credentials or her clearance or her lifetime of secrets. The rain just fell. She stood at her husband's headstone with water streaming down her face, her voice cracking open like a stone under ice. "I couldn't save Daniel," she whispered. "And now I can't even finish what you started. I failed you both." She reached into her pocket and found the old dog tags, the one she'd worn under her civilian clothes for 3 years, pressed against her skin like a heartbeat only she could feel. The ones inscribed with a rank and a name that didn't exist anymore. She placed them on the headstone beside a photograph of Daniel in dress uniform and stood there in the rain while thunder rolled across Norfolk like distant artillery. This was the lowest point. The moment when the quiet nurse was no longer a nurse at all, just a woman in a wet scrubs with a criminal record and a secret that had finally, inevitably, come undone. What happened next would change everything. Within the hour, Dr. Ashford made 3 phone calls. The first went to the Virginia Board of Nursing. He alleged Margaret had performed unauthorized surgical procedures without proper licensure, a field thoracotomy requiring credentials she didn't possess. His voice on that call was steady, professional, the voice of a concerned physician protecting public safety. The second call went to hospital administration. He demanded her immediate termination, citing patient endangerment and gross negligence. He didn't mention the medication logs. He didn't mention the drug trial. He mentioned only her recklessness, her unqualified hands, her dangerous improvisation that had violated every protocol on the books. The third call went to security. He had her building access revoked pending investigation. By 1100 hours, Margaret's badge no longer worked. The electronic reader at the main entrance beeped a dull red refusal when she tried to clock in for what she thought would be her shift. A security guard she'd known for 3 years wouldn't meet her eyes as he escorted her to the administrative office where her employment file sat on a desk like an indictment. By 1700 hours, as the evening light turned the Norfolk skyline the color of old copper, Dr. Ashford appeared on Channel 7 News. He wore his white coat and his silver cufflinks. The camera loved him. He spoke with measured concern about patient safety, about nurses operating beyond their training, about a dangerous imposter playing medic in a trauma bay while real physicians stood by helpless. He never said her name. He didn't have to. Half the hospital had watched her save a Navy SEAL's life. The other half had heard the rumors. The news crawler at the bottom of the screen read, "Local nurse under investigation for unauthorized surgical procedures." Margaret was home by then, sitting in her modest 2-bedroom apartment in the Ghent neighborhood, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee she'd forgotten to drink. The television was off. She hadn't turned it on. She'd learned long ago not to watch the news about herself. But the phone rang at 1,743 hours. It was Rita, the charge nurse, her voice shaking. "Don't turn on Channel 7. Actually, do turn it on." "No, don't." "Margaret, I'm sorry. I didn't know what he was." Margaret had already hung up. 5 hours after the broadcast, at 2,205 hours, Lieutenant Commander Hayes regained consciousness. His eyes moved first, tracking the ceiling, the monitors, the 4 lines like translucent vines holding him to the living world. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, was charting at the bedside when his hand moved. "Weak. trembling with the effort of muscles rebuilding themselves one breath at a time. His lips formed a word. Chen leaned in, her stethoscope sliding across her shoulders. His voice came as a whisper, rough as gravel, each syllable a small victory against anesthesia and trauma. One word. One name. Valkyrie. Dr. Chen froze. She'd heard that name exactly once, in a classified briefing 3 years ago about a special operations extraction in Kabul. She knew what it meant. She knew what it signified. And she knew, suddenly, with the force of a collision, exactly who that quiet, fired nurse had been. By 22:47 hours, the phone calls began again. Not from Ashford this time. From people he had no idea existed. Daniel Walsh appeared on Channel 7 at 2300 hours in dress uniform. Navy. Chief Petty Officer. His face was his mother's face, the same steady eyes, the same measured composure, though his jaw carried the weight of a son who'd been given a grave marker instead of a childhood. He sat at the news desk with Admiral Marcus Kensington beside him, and Daniel's voice never wavered. "That nurse is Major Margaret Walsh," he said. "My mother. She served 3 tours in Afghanistan. She's a decorated combat medic. She didn't break protocol. She saved a man's life using the techniques that kept me alive when no one else could reach us." The studio went quiet. The anchor's prepared follow-up questions died in her throat. Within minutes, a floor supervisor named Henderson, the same man who'd witnessed Ashford's demotion of Margaret in front of the arriving shift, sat in his office with Margaret's personnel file. The official civilian record was thin. But behind it, tucked into the jacket lining of the folder itself, was a second document. Faded. Classified stamp still visible despite the age. And sewn directly into the paper was a small patch. 5th Special Forces Group. Tan background. Gold lettering. The kind of patch you don't sew into a jacket unless you've bled under it. Henderson's hand shook as he called the hospital administrator. At 2318 hours, the SEAL team commander who'd served alongside Daniel Walsh stepped before the cameras. He wore his dress uniform like a second skin. His decorations caught the light, a silver star among them, earned the same day Daniel's patrol was hit. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of command. Major Margaret Walsh orchestrated the extraction of 12 civilians from a compound 3 kilometers from the Pakistani border in June of 2019, he said. She did it with 4 operators and a helicopter with a 20-minute fuel window. She didn't have backup. She didn't have air support. She had training, composure, and the kind of operational skill that saves lives when everything else fails. He paused. The room waited. She also earned a silver star that day. A Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds she never reported. A Defense Superior Service Medal for a classified operation so successful that it was buried in the classified archives. His eyes locked directly into the camera. She did all of that. Then she came home. Put on scrubs. And treated every broken sailor in Oak Creek Memorial like they were her own son. The feed cut to an FBI field director at 2335 hours. The agency liaison stood beside him, reading from a prepared statement. They announced that Major Margaret Walsh had been cooperating with federal investigators regarding Dr. Ashford's falsification of medication logs in the defense contractor trial. They announced that 3 patients in that trial had died from complications Ashford never reported. They announced that the trial was testing a coagulation medication destined for military field use, the same medication that, had the complications been reported, would have saved lives down the line. They announced that Dr. Harrison Ashford was now a person of interest in a federal fraud investigation involving conspiracy to commit wire fraud, falsification of clinical records, and obstruction of justice. The newsfeed cut back to Dr. Ashford mid-sentence. He was still talking about patient safety. Still talking about unqualified nurses. The camera held on his face for exactly 3 seconds as the realization hit him, the feed had been live. Everything he'd said about Margaret, everything he'd suggested about her dangerousness, had been broadcast alongside the truth about what he'd done. The station cut to commercial. By 00:47 hours, Dr. Ashford's office was sealed with federal tape. By 02:30 hours, his medical license was suspended pending investigation. By dawn, his wife's attorney had called. 60 days later, he entered a plea agreement. He would testify against the pharmaceutical company in exchange for a reduction in charges. He would not serve prison time. He would surrender his medical license permanently. He would accept a settlement with the federal government that left him with nothing but a night security position at Oak Creek Memorial, a position the hospital's board voted on specifically so that every person he'd humiliated would have to walk past him every single day. 6 months after the field thoracotomy, Margaret Walsh arrived at Oak Creek Memorial in dress uniform. The Navy Cross ceremony. The atrium was filled with military personnel whose presence made the fluorescent light seem dim by comparison, a gathering of operators and officers, their medals catching the light like small suns. Lieutenant Commander Hayes stood at the podium in his blues, thinner than he'd been in the trauma bay but standing, breathing, alive in a way that required no explanation. Margaret walked through the main entrance at 1432 hours. Her uniform was pressed with military precision. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same neat bun. Her hands, the hands that had held Hayes's bleeding heart, were steady as surgical steel. She passed the security desk. Dr. Ashford sat there in a grey guard uniform, checking badges with the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd learned never to look up. Margaret paused. 3 full seconds. Her gaze fell on him like a spotlight. He didn't lift his eyes. The tremor in his hands as he turned a page wasn't fear. It was the weight of knowing that every single day, for however long he remained in this building, he would see her walk past him. He would remember what she'd done. He would remember what he'd tried to take from her. Margaret continued to the atrium without breaking stride. Admiral Kensington stood at the podium and spoke about sacrifice. About the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. About Navy SEALs and combat medics and the invisible chain that connects those who've stood in the darkness together. Hayes received his Navy Cross to applause that sounded like thunder in the enclosed space of the atrium. Then the Admiral called Margaret forward. She stood at the podium in her dress uniform, and the room, all of it, every single person in that atrium, stood for her. The medal pinned to her chest caught the light. Defense Superior Service Medal. Public version. The classified details would remain classified. The names of the 12 civilians would remain classified. The operation itself would remain classified. But the decoration was real. The sacrifice was real. The silence that fell as she saluted was the silence of people who understood what they were witnessing. That evening, Margaret drove to the cemetery in Norfolk where her husband had been buried 14 years prior. The grave beside his held no body. Her son Daniel had requested a memorial stone, unable to be buried in the country he'd died defending. She stood at the headstone and removed her dress uniform jacket. Beneath it, she wore her service dress, the fabric beneath the formal uniform, the uniform worn under the uniform. She placed her Navy Cross beside the Defense Superior Service Medal she'd placed 6 months earlier. Next to Daniel's memorial stone, she positioned a photograph, her son in full combat gear, his arm across Hayes's shoulders, both of them grinning with the particular joy of men who'd made it through another day alive. The 3 medals gleamed in the fading light. Her late husband's stone. Her son's memorial. Her own recognition, finally visible, finally real. A young reporter who'd followed the story approached, her camera crew behind her, but Margaret raised one hand. Not a gesture of anger. A gesture of clarity. Just one line, the reporter said. Margaret looked at the graves, then at the camera, her voice steady as a heartbeat. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She saluted the headstone, a perfect military salute, the kind you only execute when the person being honored deserves the fullness of respect, and walked to her car as the sun descended behind the trees, her silver hair catching the last light of day, her limp barely visible now, her hands finally steady enough to heal. If this story resonates with you, subscribe to this channel for more stories about the quiet heroes among us. Like this video if you believe in second chances and visibility for those who've sacrificed in silence. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Tell us about it.